The biggest battle we will ever have to face is the battle between you and you. It's the battle of taking your mind to that limit and then breaking through. On the Mindful Experiment podcast, we will share concepts, universal laws, and interviewing individuals who have done just that, who have gone through the dark times and through those moments allowed their light to shine bright. I'm your host, Dr. Vic Manzo, and I want to thank you for listening to the podcast and taking this journey with me as we discover different avenues to break through those limits, expand your reality, and evolve into the person you desire to be. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hey guys, it's Dr. Vic here, and another amazing episode coming to you as I had the distinct honor of interviewing Mark Gober, who talks a bunch of science and talking about consciousness and where does it really reside from in life and quantum physics. And we went through it all. Now, if you've been an avid listener of my podcast, these are concepts that I've been bringing up to the table throughout the time since I've started this podcast. And he brings this science and shares a ton of different things to really hone in and really shift the gears to help unlock human potential, to allow us to really accelerate. And this was an awesome podcast. I was very happy to be on it. Mark he has a book that came out called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And I highly recommend it. He puts a ton of his science in there, and he uses from research from two-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee, Dr. Ervin Laszlo, and also Pixar founder and two-time Academy Award winner, Lauren Carpenter, and also adds in the chief scientist at Institute of Noetic Sciences, Dr. Dean Radin. Talks about Dr. Ed Kelly and also Larry Doser, MD, in his book. He dives into a lot of this content, and it was a great thing because I come from, although I am very scientific based, my background is a lot into energy medicine and spiritual concepts and things that have been taught about for 4,000 or 5,000 years that our ancestors, older civilizations knew about. And it's just cool how science is catching up. So we really dive into a lot of that. I promise you, this is a good one to tap into. It is going to be a lot of science for those who are just starting to get into that. Get ready. You may have to listen to us a few times, but I promise you, it's going to be one of those podcasts that are just going to mind blow you away. And you're going to come out of this like, holy cow. And the whole goal is to drastically see life in a different way than what you have, and just understand that this is kind of the movement of where it's going. And I just love having a pioneer like Mark come out and with his work and his research and everything he's doing and all the time he's spending on this stuff, really being one of the pioneers to make this change, to shift gears and really use science to prove people, hey, this is what's happening. And his whole goal of the book is dispelling the myth that the brain produces consciousness and the implications for everyday life. And so with no further ado, I'm excited to get this episode going to you. So be ready, sit back, relax, and just truly embrace and enjoy the science as I get the opportunity to bring to you Mark Gober. Well, Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
When I looked you up and looked all your info, man, I got like really excited of all the stuff you're doing, because this is like all interest points for me. So this is gonna be like a kid in a candy store for me, just to share and be straightforward here.
Well, these are my favorite topics, so I'm excited.
I love it. So your diverse background, when you got into it and all that, I mean, like, how, first off, starting off, what's your professional, your educational background? Because I want to start there, and we'll walk through as we go through all this.
Sure. So I work in Silicon Valley. I'm a partner at a firm called Sherpa Technology Group, and we advise technology companies on their business strategy and on mergers and acquisitions. I've been doing that for over 8 years now. Prior to Sherpa, I was at UBS, a large global investment bank, and I was there during the financial crisis, actually. Ooh. July of 2008 was my first day of work.
Oh, man.
So I did that until 2010. And prior to working in investment banking in New York, I I was a student at Princeton University where I was captain of the tennis team. So between, when I tell people about my background, it's been very business focused and athletically focused. And meanwhile, I have a book on consciousness. So people usually ask the question of what's the connection there?
That was going to be my next question. How did you go from that and then totally shift over the consciousness?
Yeah. It wasn't a planned thing. Let's put it that way.
I can relate. I could totally relate to that.
Yeah, I wasn't. It started with podcasts. That's the short answer. I was listening to business podcasts at first and then health podcasts. And then a woman came on one of the health podcasts. Her name's Laura Powers. This was August 2016. And she started talking about psychic abilities and how she talks to dead people and works with energies. And she said that as a child, she used to see things, but then kind of shut it out of her life, and her life didn't go in a great direction. And then when she let the things back in, her life got a lot better. And now professionally, she works with clients. And I just never even heard of these things before in any serious way beyond maybe science fiction movies. So it didn't really change my life or anything, but it was interesting to hear someone talk about these things. And she didn't sound like she was trying to make it up. And I remembered at the end of that podcast, she said, well, I have my own podcast and it's called Healing Powers, where I interview other people who have very similar experiences. So I said, that's kind of interesting because I'm looking for a new podcast to listen to. And I have a long drive because I live in San Francisco, but our office is down in the peninsula in the San Mateo area. So that's a long drive on the 101. So I was like, okay, let me just turn that one on and see if it's interesting. So I turned her podcast on and just kind of let it play for a few weeks while I was driving to and from the office. And at first it didn't really register that so many people were saying similar things about their personal experiences. But then after a while, I got really interested because it registered, wait a second, these people are all saying very similar things about their experiences, and they're not related to each other. And they all sound like they're pretty genuine. So unless they're having pretty serious delusions or hallucinations about something, maybe something's going on. And it led me down the path of just personal research where I started to actually look at the science behind this, which I'm sure we'll discuss today. I saw things from the US government, from Princeton University, from the University of Virginia, and lots of very credible research that has been done for decades. And then I got super interested and realized that something was up. And I would combine that with the fact that I started to, I said, well, if this research is real and if these people on the podcast can actually do extraordinary things, then I should be able to have sessions with people and they should be able to also sometimes do extraordinary things. And sure enough, when I had sessions with different energy workers and psychics that didn't know anything about me and they were over the phone, some of them knew things that they just could not have known. It wasn't all the time, but it was like, okay, this is lining up with the research. And in short, it really flipped my worldview because I had to suddenly reconcile all of this new information with my with what I used to think was real, and I couldn't do it. So I ended up researching for a year straight of just very heavy stuff. And my friends remember I kind of went into a cave where there were just books all over my apartment. And prior to that, I wasn't really doing much reading. And it just became just a personal passion. And I was never planning on writing a book, actually, in that process. It was just out of personal interest to understand what reality is under this alternative paradigm, and decided that I should just put it on paper. And this was in the summer of 2017. And part of what prompted me to do that was a number of friends told me that what I was conveying to them had a big impact on how they thought about life. Like the notion of the idea that consciousness doesn't die when the body dies. That's a big one for people who might fear death, for example. And I was talking about evidence suggesting that's true. So people were very interested. And I said, okay, why don't I just try to write something? And I sat down over the 4th of July weekend in July 2017 and ended up writing more than half the book that weekend. And then over the next few weekends, I just finished it up because I had the structure in place and just kind of had it all in my head. And then so I came out of July 2017 with a book, and that's the book that just came out in October.
Awesome. I love it. And we're going to definitely dive into the book. I wanted to, so was it the research that you spent a year in, or was it your experience? Like, was there something that just like said, okay, this is not bullshit. I'm totally sold. And now I got to dive in and do all this research? Or was it just over time with the research and all that, you kind of were just like, yeah, there's something to this?
It was more of a gradual process. I mean, I've heard a lot of people who have a single mystical experience and it changes their whole life. Like they have a near-death experience and then they were one thing one day and then another thing the next. For me, it was much more gradual, where I would hear something and it would be like 2 steps forward in that direction. And then I would go about my daily life and kind of forget about it because we're so biased by what our eyes can show us. And then I would listen to another podcast and I would go a few more steps forward and then go back. And it was like this back and forth for a while. Eventually, I got so far forward with the evidence that I saw that I literally could not reconcile my old worldview with that new evidence.
I love it. I'm asking just because that's kind of like my personal journey has been. My background's in energy medicine. So I've studied energy medicine. I've seen bizarre things happen where people have, a grapefruit tumor in them and 4 days later it's gone. And it's like, how the hell did that happen? And we'll chat about that a little later on that part. But it was those type of experiences where, like you said, you go talk to someone, they're sharing information that they can impossibly not know.
Yeah.
Cool stuff. I love it. But let's go ahead. So, talking about the book. So let's just dive a little bit into that. We're talking about psychic abilities, afterlife, consciousness doesn't die. Is that kind of what the book's about, or is it a little deeper?
It touches on those things, but I think maybe we should start with the fundamental premise, because it makes possible a lot of these things that sound totally crazy.
Let's do it.
The way I now frame things after having done the research, I certainly didn't start looking at it this way, but everything centers around the question of consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I mean, like right now I'm speaking to you, I have an awareness, I have a personal sense of identity. It's like my subjective inner experience. It's something that's always been there. It's like my mind, but I can't touch it. It's not this physical thing. I can't really put my finger on what it is, but we all have it. So the question is, how does that get there? And what I would have said to you 2+ years ago is, well, don't we already know the answer to that? Why are you asking me? Don't we know that chemical activity in our brain creates that conscious experience? What I didn't realize until I got into the research is that, number one, there's a major question about this. And Science magazine actually calls it the number 2 question that remains in all of science. As they put it, what is the biological basis of consciousness? In other words, how does our body, our physical biology, like I can touch my leg, I can touch my arm, can touch my head. If you ask me to touch my mind, I can't do it. And this is the question. How does this physical body that is touchable produce a non-physical consciousness? The open secret is that we do not know the answer to this question. So that alone is a really big deal, because we can send people to the moon and there are tons of scientific advancements all the time. And yet our very own awareness and consciousness is still a big mystery. So that's important, number one. Where I tend to take things is based on this evidence we'll be discussing, is the reason we haven't figured out the answer to the question of what is the biological basis of consciousness is that there is no biological basis of consciousness in the first place. In other words, our consciousness, our awareness is not a product of our brain or of our body, but rather our brain is more like an antenna receiver, or more precisely like a filtering mechanism that is processing a consciousness that is not from the body itself. And that explains why we see such a close relationship between the brain and consciousness. Like if someone gets in a car accident and then they have impaired memory, or you stimulate a part of the brain that's responsible for vision, and all of a sudden the person sees differently. We see a strong correlation between what happens in our brain and the type of experience we have. The potential error that we might be making, and I think the history books may look back at this and say, oh my goodness, I can't believe they thought this way. They made such a big error that's obvious, is that we're making an assumption in traditional science that because there's this very strong relationship between what we do to the brain and what happens to our conscious experience, we're assuming that the brain must then produce the conscious experience, when there's an alternative possibility, which is that like the brain is a processor. And just very quickly, there's an important analogy here. And in statistics, people call it correlation is not causation.
Yep.
The example that I like is from Dr. Bernardo Castro, a philosopher who's looked at this problem too, who says that, imagine you have a fire that shows up. And in Bay Area, we actually have some fires right now.
Yep.
Firefighters show up. We have a bigger fire, more firefighters show up. There's a really strong correlation between how big the fire is and how many firefighters are showing up. Now, in this situation with fires and firefighters, do we conclude that the firefighters were the cause of the fire?
I love it.
No, we don't.
Of course not.
We don't, but there's a strong correlation. So this might be the error that we're making with consciousness, is to say, oh, there's such a strong correlation. Like all these things that are happening to the brain are we can see the exact change in the consciousness. Well, that doesn't tell us that the brain produces it. So it's a really big, if your listeners take one thing away from this interview, it's, I think, to acknowledge, number one, that there is a huge open question about consciousness and how it's produced, and that there is a potential alternative which treats the brain as a processor of consciousness.
Have you ever heard of the girl who basically didn't have a brain and she could function, had memories and all that stuff?
I have heard stories of this where people they get in an accident, so their brain is scanned, and it turns out they have very little brain mass, and yet they have a normal IQ.
Yeah. And so that was one of the things that like baffled, I think I was in school 10 years ago almost now, where they came up with that, and they were talking about it because one of the guys, the teachers I was talking to was big into energy medicine and consciousness and all that. And he's like, we think it's in the brain, but it's not. That's the flaw that I love how you brought up, because if it is biological, if it was, you can bring back dead people. You just have to figure out the biological pathway. Go ahead, boom, here they come. They come back to life. But obviously, there's something deeper to that.
Yep, I agree with you. And you raised a really important point here, which is a pattern that is seen throughout science that I think is easy to sweep under the rug, which is that there are a number of instances of reduced brain functioning, or in some cases, actually reduced brain mass, and yet there is kind of an enriched conscious experience. And there are a few examples to point to, because it matches with the idea that our brain is like a filter, where when our brain is actually less active, we are exposing ourselves to the broader reality that's always been there, but which our brain is typically filtering out of our perception.
I love that. And it's kind of like and I think I'm grasping here what you're talking about is like that everything always it filters things, and everything always exists. It's just what's filtering through. Right. Exactly. So it's a new way to think about our brain and our body, is that it is the lens through which consciousness is having the experience. And it's like in the studies I've done, it's like they always say, like, imagine like Earth, we have computers, we got technology now, we have all this. It always existed. We just had to shift gears, allow more information to come in, and then all of a sudden we can create that. But it's always been here.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But it's difficult for many people to wrap their heads around this. And I think I'm one of those people, because I haven't maybe had those experiences where I've personally seen the broader reality that at least I can remember. And for people who haven't experienced it firsthand, it can be difficult.
Totally. Have you ever heard about, when it comes to consciousness, have you ever studied or looked into how it binds into the body? How does that merge and give life to the body at all?
It's a question that I do talk about in the book, and it's one that I think is not well answered.
Gotcha.
But until we appreciate that the brain is not the producer of consciousness, people won't be looking at that question.
True. I totally agree with you there. Yeah, this is cool stuff. So you talk about that in the book. What else do we got going on?
Okay, I want to go back to this point that we were talking about of reduced brain functioning and heightened conscious experience, because that, again, it matches the pattern of the brain being like a filter. So one area is psychedelic research, which has kind of just restarted in the last few years, because there's a ban on looking at it clinically. But there was a study in 2012, for example, on psilocybin, which is the active hallucinogen in magic mushrooms. And what the researchers found when they did brain scans was that when people were tripping on the hallucinogen, they actually had reduced functioning in parts of their brain. So again, we have a enriched experience that feels like, a hyper real trip, and it's correlated with less brain activity. So that's one example. Another is the near-death experience, which I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail later. But these are cases where people they're in cardiac arrest, for example, where they have their heart's off, they're clinically dead, there's no blood flowing to their brain, or they're just they have severe physiological trauma in some other way. And yet they're having this enriched experience where it's realer than real, and they're seeing things that happen in the room when they hover over their body, but they're verified as being accurate. These are cases where we have a reduction in brain activity, or sometimes no brain activity, and yet an enriched consciousness. It all matches with the idea of the brain as a filter.
Yeah, no, totally. I guess we will dive into near-death experiences. That was a big passion for mine, because you're talking about like psychedelics, and I wrote this in my book. I tested out. Well, not tested. I felt like I had to do ayahuasca for some reason and couldn't explain why, didn't know why. It was just a calling. The universe kept showing me things and it just kept showing up in my reality. And I was like, all right, this is maybe something I need to do. Went through it. Long story short, it put me on a path that I was like, I needed to know what happens after we die. I was just so, because I died during that experience. It was not literally. It was what it taught. It showed me what death was because I had a huge fear of death. And after I came out, I was like, I just had this burning desire to know what's the afterlife, what's the spirit world, where do we come from, who are we, what are we really all about? And one of the big things I loved researching, because there's so much data on this, and I know you know this already, near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I was looking up when I was looking at some of this stuff is like a woman, and you were just talking about, hovering over her body and being accurate details. How this one lady, I think it was a car accident, she died on there. They were trying to resuscitate her back. And long story short, she was able to come back to life. But she talks about her whole experience. I'm going to keep that short. But it was like after 6 months, it took her to recover. She knew it. She wanted to go back. She knew who the doctor was that did the surgery. She knew what room she was in. She knew everything, even though she was clinically dead. And she wanted to come back, and she came back and wanted to thank the doctor and said, "You're the one that did the surgery on me. I watched what you do. I knew what you were thinking. I felt that, your confidence." And she just went through this whole story. And I was just like, holy shit, excuse my French. But I was like, this is cool. So near death, let's talk about it.
Yeah, this is a big one. And I have a whole chapter on it in my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, because I think it might actually give us hints into the broader reality if we view the consciousness as not being tied to the brain, if we view these experiences as not being just hallucinations. Mm-hmm. So again, if we view consciousness as not being a product of the brain, then what that model predicts is that when the body dies, our consciousness doesn't die. That's just kind of definitional. If consciousness doesn't come from the body, then it's not dependent on the body. So these things would in theory be possible. So yes. What is the near-death experience? This is something that has been reported for a long time. So Plato talked about it, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but it was only really in the last few decades where it became kind of a household name thing. And it's largely because of, I think, two things. Number one, resuscitation technology, bringing people back from severe physiological ailments has gotten better. So if you're in cardiac arrest, we can bring you back now. So there's more of an opportunity for people to talk about their experiences. And also Dr. Raymond Moody in 1975 wrote a book on near-death experiences, and that he actually coined the term. So now there are a lot more people looking at this, and there are many millions of people that have had variations of the experience. But it's while they are in this state of severe impairment that they talk about like different steps. And not everyone has all of the steps, but many of them are typically reported, where the person talks about like a feeling of unconditional love and hovering over their body and seeing things in the room. Sometimes it's accurate, what they're like, seeing specific things in the room from a vantage point above their body that are shown to be accurate. They talk about seeing deceased loved ones sometimes, or mystical beings, as they call them. And then they also talk about a life review, which to me is one of the most important findings that throughout all of my research, where people are reviewing their own life and they're judging themselves for how they were treating people as they're seeing all the events that happened. In some cases, they experience those events through the eyes of the people that they affected, and they feel the pain that they inflicted on that person. And they come back in their body after the experience, and their lives are changed because they realize that their life is not about material gains. Rather, it's more about how they treat people. So many people after the near-death experience often get divorced, or they change their job, and their priorities shift drastically.
Yeah, that is so true. And I love the life review. Why do you think it's important to have a life review besides just seeing how you treat people?
It's just a big question. I mean, why does the life review happen in the first place? It gets to questions about whether life has meaning or not. And maybe part of the meaning of being here is about treating each other well because we're interconnected as part of the same consciousness, even though it seems like we're fundamentally separate.
I love that. And when you say we're all connected, is that like unified field stuff?
Yeah, there are different terms for it. And it's kind of the ultimate conclusion I get to in the book, which is that just the current paradigm in science says that the brain produces consciousness, or more generally, matter produces consciousness, because the brain's made of matter. So you started with a material universe. It led to the evolution of a human that had a brain, and then consciousness came out. What I and many others are arguing is that no, consciousness actually comes first. Consciousness is primary, and we are all connected as part of the same underlying consciousness, even though we have this kind of diverse experience through different body lenses, so to speak.
In your book, do you bring up any things on like quantum physics principles and stuff like that have kind of been helping prove like some of the things that show everything comes from thought or non-form to form kind of thing?
Yes. So chapter 3 is all about quantum physics. And I think we should talk about a few of those phenomena, because it's important to understand that the underpinnings of our reality by proven science point in this direction. And in fact, Max Planck, who's a Nobel Prize winner in 1931, he's one of the pioneers of quantum physics. He said, after looking at the findings, I regard consciousness as fundamental, and I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. That's what he said. And that's exactly what you and I are talking about.
Oh, yeah. And so what studies or what stuff do you have in the book, or that you've shared that help kind of support these principles?
Okay, I think there are two things we should talk about. One is called entanglement, and the other one is called the observer effect.
Love it. Keep going.
Okay. So, this is important to know because it's proven stuff. It's been around for about 100 years. And yet in our everyday experience, we don't talk about it. We don't think about it. We don't see it.
So true.
Entanglement. And Albert Einstein looked at this, and he called it spooky action at a distance. And he tried to disprove it because it was so mind-blowing to him. This is what it says, is that I'm simplifying this drastically. You have two physical particles, okay, like things that you can touch, like an atom or something physical. One is here, one is far away, not physically next to each other. When you spin or affect one particle, the other one is instantaneously affected in a correlated way. It like mirrors the other one, but at the same instant, as if there was nothing traveling between them, as if there's a connection.
Yep.
Okay, so this is why Einstein didn't like it, because Einstein thought that the speed of light was the fastest that anything could travel. And yet here we have an instantaneous or a simultaneous reaction.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, but this is now. So Einstein tried to disprove it when he found out about it, and actually in the process of trying to disprove it, he further proved that it's a real thing. And now in science, entanglement is it is generally accepted as being real. So this gets to the point potentially of some kind of interconnectedness, maybe even at the level of consciousness that we are not seeing with our eyes. And in fact, there's a great book by Dr. Dean Radin, who studied many of these things. It's called Entangled Minds, where he looks at psychic phenomena and ties it to quantum properties.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, quantum entanglement is, we're all interconnected in some shape or form. And when I talk about healing for people, I bring that up a lot, because I always tell people that no matter what you do in your life at this time, and there's been so many studies on this, that you can actually change the history of your ancestry and your lineage by breaking that pattern. So when you heal, you're healing everyone from before, and you're changing the course of the future because of quantum entanglement.
Yes, I have heard about this, and there are things like, like family constellation work that gets into this kind of a thing of working with, ancestral issues, but at a non-physical level. And people talk about how you can affect a lot from that.
Yeah, there was a study done. You ever hear of Dr. Joe Dispenza?
Yes.
Phenomenal dude. And he, in one of his books, he talks about the science of when there was 3,000 some odd people who had this infection in a hospital, and he did this prayer, and they were talking about the power of prayer and all this stuff. And I'll keep it short. But long story short, they ended up as they were praying in 2000 for this. The guy who was, when he was in the book, he's like, is it just a coincidence that 3,400 some odd people in one hospital had an infection, or was it something else? And what they were trying to prove was quantum entanglement. And what they did was they were praying for people from the years of 1994 to 1996 in 2000. And when they did the prayers, what they found out is the people who were still alive, there were some that passed away from the infection, but the ones who were still alive, their lives improved immensely when they were praying and thinking about them back in 1994 and 1996. And so I'm kind of maybe butchering this research here a little bit because I'm trying to be quick with it, but it's, again, are we really we're in a linear space time, but is it really just in this reality, or can we affect things without time?
Yeah. Well, that's actually where I do take things in the book, which is this idea that not only is consciousness fundamental, but it is beyond all space and time. So that these effects that you just described, which is basically the effect of intention at a non-local time,
Yep.
simply is having it's non-local physically and non-local temporally.
Oh yeah,
be an effect, and that is what a lot of the research in my book is talking about is non-locality.
I love it. And so we talked a little bit about quantum entanglement. Let's talk about the observer effect. So what's that? How's that work?
It's such an important one, and it's really mind blowing. It's like the some people I think have called it the skeleton in the closet for physicists, because it's the big mystery. And I will simplify this drastically. There's an experiment called the double slit laser experiment, and basically when you shoot a particle through this experiment, and when you are looking at it, when you're looking at the experiment, the particle, and by particle I mean something like physical. My table's made of atoms, particles. When you look at it, it behaves like a particle. But when you're not looking, it behaves like a wave. And a wave means that it has a probabilistic state where it's maybe here, maybe there. It's not in a definitive location. It's not like a solid thing. So when you're looking, it's like a particle. When you're not looking, it's like a wave. The behavior of this particle is changing based on whether or not you are observing it. You're not touching it. It's whether you are observing it. So this is the question. What does that mean? So is it because we're shining light on it? What does it mean to observe? Does it mean that the consciousness of the observer is what is affecting how this particle or wave is behaving? And there's a big rift in science over this. Some people say that it's consciousness, and some very prominent physicists have said, yeah, it's consciousness entering the picture. And this is kind of proving that consciousness is steering our physical reality. Like Max Planck said, consciousness is fundamental. There are others that say, well, no, it just has to do with the fact that we're shining a light on it or something I don't fully understand. And there's all kinds of theories about this, that it's not consciousness. I would argue that consciousness is playing a role.
And I would agree with you. Just like I've said, I do a lot of coaching stuff. And when I'm working with visions and stuff, I always tell people everything that exists in the physical world had to come from non-physical, everything. And I use the observer effect a lot, because it's one of those things, how you view things is what it becomes. If you're looking at it one way, here you go. If you look at it another way, here you go. And I don't know if you would agree or not, but it's kind of like, for me, that's a definitive to know that I am the creator of my life, but at the same token, I'm also the producer, I'm the artist, I'm the main actor, I am XYZ, because if I observe, things shift. If I'm not paying attention, it just stays in waveform.
Yes. And I want to point to a recent study, which I think even many physicists are not aware of, that gets to this exact question of, well, is it consciousness involved, or is it just some other effect that has nothing to do with consciousness? And this is Dr. Dean Radin, who I had just mentioned he wrote the book Entangled Minds. He said, okay, well, we can test this. Why don't we tell people to put their mental attention to this experiment, and we'll see if it behaves more like a particle when they're mentally focusing on it, meaning that they're not even physically observing it. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is an easy way to test if consciousness is steering reality. And what he finds in his studies, and he's gotten them into 2 peer-reviewed science journals, Physics Essays and Quantum Biosciences, he got extremely statistically significant results that the mind is shifting the particle-like behavior in this study when you're not even physically there to look at it.
Love it. That's pretty cool stuff right there. I'm going to definitely check out that one.
Yep. And they're waiting for more replications. I think it's very difficult to get physicists to look at this because it's so outlandish. But there is one replication that came out recently from someone in Brazil. But he told Dr. Radin, and I'll read you a quote from this. I love it. As he was doing the study, this is just a physicist, and physicists are typically not thinking about consciousness. As he was replicating the study, he said, "In the last days, it has been an intense mixture of feelings. I'm oscillating between, oh my God, and wait, something must be wrong."
I love it. That is awesome. That is awesome. Yeah, because what is it? Back in the day, most physicists believed God didn't exist. And I heard from what I'm keep hearing, they're starting to believe that there is a greater power. There is something that's all I don't want to say all knowing, just all great. I guess that's the word I want to use.
Yeah. Well, look, when you start bringing consciousness into the picture, into physics, it raises all kinds of questions of what is consciousness? If consciousness is the basis of the physical, what does that mean for all of us? So I think physicists have to ask these questions.
I agree. And in some things, here's some other things I've looked at, because like when I started looking into all this and back, 8-10 years ago, and I wanted to know, okay, if this is true, I got to see it in other areas. And Dr. Masaru Emoto, he did the water experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Have you heard that one before? Yeah. Right. And so right there, if you look at water and you put love to it, the molecular structure changes into crystallized hexagonal form, which is the highest vibrational frequencies of water and the most highest level that it is. Where if you put it hate, all of a sudden it's very disorganized, chaos, more entropy. And it's one of those things where it's like, there's mind shifting matter right there. That's the consciousness playing an effect. And there's more studies. I don't know if you heard it's been around on Facebook a little bit now. They were looking at a group of people, looking at a plant and saying how much they love it and enjoy it and appreciate it. And then they had another side where people were saying, I hate you, can't stand you, all these things. And I forgot how, I don't remember, I didn't get to the length of time they did that for, which I know it had at least be for a couple of weeks. But the one that said love was vibrant and healthy and just amazing, where the other one was dying and withered away.
Yeah, I've heard of studies like this, and I wish there were more scientists that were running like controlled versions of this that are in journals, so that people would actually start looking at it a bit more. But on this topic, there were lots of studies done at Princeton University by the former dean of engineering on a very similar topic, which is how does the mind affect a physical process? And this is a guy. He was a rocket scientist, very credible. Dean of engineering. And when I was at Princeton, he was there running this lab, and I didn't even know about it because it was so controversial.
Oh, wow.
They allowed it to run because of his reputation, but even within Princeton, apparently people were not super happy about it. He was looking at whether the mind, people's mental intentions could affect a machine called a random number generator. Meaning the machine.
Sorry, okay, go ahead. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so these are machines that they spit out zeros and ones in a completely random fashion. So when you look at the string of zeros and ones that come out, you end up with 50% ones and 50% zeros over the long term. What they've done in these studies is to ask people to put their mind to the machine. And they say, hey, Bob, I want you to try to make the machine produce more ones than zeros without touching it, just like will it mentally to do it. Use your will. And what did the experimenters find is that there is a slight effect. So there is a statistical effect that you need to do the math to see it, but there's slightly more ones than zeros in a non-chance way.
Yeah, I've heard of that before, and it's amazing. Just what the mind can do, on that level. Being in the health field, I look at the mind in the sense of how can it influence our life in different ways. And there was there's so many studies out there now about it, where like individuals who like test 8 weeks and they work out 5 days a week and they work out their muscles and so forth. And then they're going to evaluate how much strength, how much muscle fibers and strength did they gain in 8 weeks. And, they'll have let's say 30%. Then they'll have another group do the same thing, but not physically, just mentally. Feel the muscles in their mind, feel the activation of the muscles, the fibers and so forth. And the percentage of growth after the 8-week process is not 30%, but 22%. Mm-hmm. And then just the power behind that. So just, it's cool. And is it ever going to get to that point as you see a movement, a change where they're going to start to be like, hey, you know what? Consciousness affects physical. Consciousness is, not in the brain. Are we getting closer to that?
That's exactly why I wrote this book, because I personally felt in the research that there is more than enough science to suggest that this is not only a real thing, but that we need to be devoting a lot of time as a society to this. Whereas most of mainstream academia is calling this nonsense. And basically, if you want to talk about these things, you can't get tenure. So what scientists are having to do is they wait until they get tenure if they want to open their mouth about it. But even still, many of them are afraid to talk about it. So your options are basically leave academia altogether and be considered crazy as a scientist, right? Or just hide your interest in it. So it's not a very conducive environment to progress in these areas. So I felt the need to put it all in one place so that someone who's a true scientist, and scientists are supposed to be open to evidence, not it shouldn't be a belief-based thing. It should be, what do the studies show? To say, well, if all of these studies have some validity, and to me, the fact it's hard to reason that all of this stuff, that every single thing is a delusion or a result of bad statistics or something like that, then we've got to look at this. We can't just say, oh, it's a small effect, we don't need to worry. If there's an effect, we have to explain it.
It's so funny how you're saying that, because in my world, this is medical versus chiropractic. Not saying they're going against each other, but it's one of those things where chiropractors are always, or at least chiropractor like I am in the groups I'm part of, we're always like, there is evidence that proves X, Y, Z. Why are we still doing old school stuff that's more of a belief system than it is real science? And it sounds like you're saying the exact same thing. We're like, why are we still holding on to those things when there's all this research that can prove and get things changing in a different direction?
Completely. Yeah, I think the medical field is another one that could use these things, because if our mind is affecting physical reality, then what's the effect of the mind on the body?
Yep.
And actually, this brings me to another chapter in the book that directly relates to medicine. I talk about children who have memories of a previous life.
Mm-hmm.
And this comes from the University of Virginia at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the med school. For 50 years, they've looked at over 2,500 cases of children who have memories that are very distinct, and they're not from their own life very clearly. And in some cases, the strongest ones, the researchers are able to find exact people that match the description that the child talks about. But to your point about medicine, in some of the cases, and I think the strongest ones, are ones where the children have birthmarks or physical deformities that match how they describe dying in the previous life, where they're so specific. And there's one that I show in the book of a girl whose leg it looks like she has constriction rings, like it's been tied in ropes, like if there's an indentation that's so clear that's not a normal leg, and yet there's no rope. It's just the natural shape of her leg. And in fact, there was a person that died in that manner who was tortured, and the girl describes the torture, and it happened to a real person. So if we accept these things as being real, where there's a physical effect to the body that is related to some previous life, so to speak, that means that something that is beyond genetics and beyond environment is playing a role in the body. This is a total revolution in medicine. And the researchers at UVA call it a third factor, whereas conventional medicine say it's all about the genes and it's all about environment.
Yep, totally. No, I totally agree. And even on the spiritual world, they always say, like in the spiritual realms, they'll talk about, a soul, a consciousness can, from past life. And I know past doesn't really exist, but just for human sake, we'll just keep it that way. Past life, a linear framework.
Right.
They'll talk about sometimes they'll carry things over into this life because they want to. It's a memory thing. Because I was always curious. I mean, I read up these things and I hear about those stories and I'm just like, okay, why? Why is that happening? What's the purpose behind it? So, and then I do a ton of research and get some answers. There's actually someone on the news. I was shocked they put it on the news. There was a boy who was born, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. You may have heard of this. And he was from World War II. And he knew he was from World War II. He said, I was in the war. He had his name figured out and everything. They went to look him up, pulled up a picture of World War II. He was in the Navy, I believe. And he's like, that was my friend who was with me. He died here in this ship on this time at this date and everything. And they went to fact check it and he was dead on.
Yeah, it might be one of the stories that I mentioned in the book on this is done at the University of Virginia, a boy who talks about being in World War II and dying in a crash. And he had very specific details. And there was a person that died in this exact manner.
Yep. That sounds like that's what it was. And, but yeah, it's just crazy. And for me, I was always like, okay, who can I find resources to? And then maybe not be science-based. It's going to be more on the spiritual side, but I want to understand how. So I reach out to mediums and people, those types of things to find out. And when they explain it, it's just like, oh, that's pretty cool. All right. So it's not in our minds, the way the mind works, as you know, it likes straight facts, straight one way. This is how it is. Newtonian type physics in a sense.
Exactly.
And they're like, no, it's quantum. It's random. It could be this or it could be that. It could be whatever you want it to be. It's so variable.
This is such an important point. It's one I actually make in the book as well, which is that in fields outside of physics, like medicine, like doctors are not trained in quantum physics. Their worldview is very much a Newtonian one, which is really good as an approximation of reality, but it's not going to get us to the actual reality. No,
not at all. And that's why, again, being a chiropractor, the way I practice in my office is all quantum. It's all quantum. We call it tonal based. And it's just, I always tell patients, I don't know what I'm adjusting until I check, and I'm checking to see what your body needs. Half the time when we make the adjustment, I can get linear Newtonian style, but then I'm like, but that's not going to really be the truth. I have no idea why this area needs adjustment over this area. But what I do know is the body is, well, the consciousness, I guess you want to call it, or we call it in chiropractic, innate intelligence. I'm just connecting with that, and it's telling me what I need to do, and I'm doing it, and we get miraculous results from it. So it's kind of cool.
Amazing. We need more doctors doing that.
Yeah, it's growing. It's getting there. But let's keep chatting on this book and everything. I know we talked a little bit about, consciousness surviving. Does consciousness survive after the body dies and so forth? And what's your research on that? Your evidence behind it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to go back to the near-death experience and some of the studies on that, because this really does get to the question of is the consciousness existing independently of the body? And some people will continue to argue, well, no, it's just the brain is pumping out chemicals or something, and it's a hallucination that happens around the time of death, and it's just like an evolutionary mechanism that causes this experience. What certain people have done, and very credible people like Dr. Pim Van Lommel, who's a cardiologist, and Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, is to run studies on people who have cardiac arrest. And these are people who are basically clinically dead. And the studies seek to interview these people who have been resuscitated right after they've been resuscitated and are functional again. Whereas many of the older studies they're called retrospective, where you talk to someone who recalls their near-death experience 20 years ago. And who knows what kinds of memories come and go between that, and if it's been fabricated or they just misremember things. In these studies, they're called prospective. The doctors are there right after the person's resuscitated. So it's like a very clear memory. And some of these have been reported in credible journals, like Dr. Van Lommel's study was published in The Lancet, which is a very credible journal. In his study, 18%, 1/8 of the people that were resuscitated from cardiac arrest reported a near-death experience. I mean, under the conventional view of the brain and consciousness, it should be 0%. You shouldn't be able to have any lucid memories. And yet he's getting 18%. I mean, that is like a world-changing finding. How in the world is that happening? So that's one that's a really important one for your listeners who want to look at this more. Another is this topic that we kind of touched on. It's called formally a veridical out-of-body experience. And veridical meaning that when the person is quote unquote out of their body, the things that they see in the room are verified as being accurate, like hence the word veridical. There was a journal study in Resuscitation Journal by Dr. Sam Parnia, who looked at people in cardiac arrest. And one of the people came back and talked about his near-death experience and was talking about very specific sounds in the room. And the timing of those sounds were during the time of cardiac arrest and during the time there was no brain functioning. So clearly, it is a verified experience that was specific to his experience that happened during the time of no brain functioning, which is getting to this question of life after death. Do we need a body to have a consciousness? And what these studies are pointing to is the notion that no, we don't need a functioning body to have a consciousness, which therefore seems to imply that our consciousness can survive when our body dies.
I love it. And it's so true. And one of the things that, for me, that made this solidified was the law of thermodynamics. I think it's the second law from or the law of thermodynamics that states energy is never created or destroyed. It's always changing form. Mm-hmm. And, we're in form right now. When we pass, we're going to transform into another form. May spiritual people call it our light body instead of our physical body. But it's one of those things where, 10,000 plus near-death experience studies that have been out there or documented, there's something to that. And how do you think, people taking that in and starting to see this information, how's it going to change things? How's it going to change their lives? How's it going to change? What is it? Number one, I think public speaking is over death. So number two thing that people fear is death and end of life. What do you think? How's that going to change things?
Yeah. I mean, I can give you the perspective from my old worldview, which is very much in the conventional or was in the conventional framework, which says that I am conscious solely because of my brain. And therefore, when my body and my brain die, my consciousness is gone. My memories are gone, my feelings, anything that happened during my life, it's all wiped out. So if you really think about what that means, and I used to think about this very honestly, that there can be no real meaning in that life. because no matter what happens to you, whether it's good or bad during your life, it's wiped out once you're dead. And it's going to happen to everybody who's in a body. So I think it's coming up with meaning under the conventional framework, which science is teaching, implies that there is no meaning in life and that any meaning that you come up with is just a rationalization. So that's kind of where I was, because I thought that's what science said. And here we have the potential notion that consciousness is surviving when the body dies. So just that alone that can really rock somebody, because wait a second, wait, maybe I don't die when my body dies. So what happens to me after I die? And am I accountable for things that happen in my life? Like in the life review, that actually it can put some pressure on people.
Yep, it does. I love that. Yeah, and again, I grew up with family members who said the same thing. Not with like saying, "Oh, my mind." They just go, "When I'm dead, everything's gone, blackout, no more. This is it." And so, since you've shifted your gears with this in a different perspective, how much has this changed your life?
So drastically, so drastically. I mean, it just shifts it really is a shift of identity at the core, and everything else is an offshoot of that. If you buy into it's called the materialist view of reality, that matter creates consciousness, then our identity is our body. We are a body that has a consciousness for a limited amount of time, and I'm fundamentally separate from everybody, even though we have similar genetics because we're in the same species. I am fundamentally separate, and I have a finite existence. I'm a body that has a consciousness. This alternative reality says, no, I am a consciousness first and foremost that is experiencing this physical world through a body. And at the level of consciousness, I'm actually connected to everybody.
Love it.
It's totally different.
Massively. And so then why does consciousness come into the experience? I wouldn't just say human, but just the physical world in general.
Yeah, this is a big question. And I think the best I can do is come up with an inference. And I look at this all the time, and you have to look at a lot of like anecdotal accounts and psychics and people with near-death experiences. But I think the life review, again, is an important one, because what people report in that, like this notion that somebody is switching perspectives from their perspective of some past event to being in the body of somebody else and experiencing it through them, it really suggests that it's the same consciousness that's underlying everything that just happens to be able to switch lenses in that dimension. And what that suggests to me is that we need to take those events very seriously. So the life review seems to imply that the bodily experience is about learning and growing and evolving the underlying consciousness through our own individual experiences, but also throughout the collective, because we're all part of the same consciousness.
Gotcha. And that comes right back again to the unified field, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I had a mentor one time tell me, spiritual mentor, who was talking about how, and it just lines with what you're saying, that all our experiences, that what we have gets shared upon. So it's shared to the earth's consciousness, it's shared to the universe's consciousness, and it just keeps going up the ladder until whatever you want to call the main supreme being, all that is, or the God, for people relate to that, although there's a lot of religious connotation to that, to that factor. And is that kind of what you see it as in that way too?
Yeah, that there's one underlying basis of all reality. It's not a physical, tangible thing, and it is the core of our own identity. So our identity as consciousness is this kind of unchanging awareness that is experiencing this physical life through a multitude of bodies or whatever in the physical. But it is not really, it's untouched by the physical, because it is just the witness of everything. And that is the core of identity and the core of physical reality, as I think that's the most likely picture.
I love it. And so then what is the purpose of consciousness? I know this is even a deeper question.
No, I think that's good. These are important.
Yeah.
I think we start to get into areas that transcend the linear human mind. So I want to preface with that. Like, we're trying to come up with answers through this body that has just inherent limitations. So for example, the concept of infinity, it's something that in math we accept as a being a real thing, but I mean, we can't understand infinity. We can't actually grasp what that means. So I think that's something we're dealing with here, is what is the meaning of life? Why does consciousness exist? And why is it even trying to learn? I'll give you the answer that I've kind of come to through my research, just from looking at a lot of different things and trying to explain it through a human mind to the extent it's even possible. Okay. And I would preface it by saying that whatever answer I give is not, the answer ultimately is probably something that we can never comprehend.
Yeah.
But it seems like Consciousness simply is beyond all space and time. So there's no beginning and end to consciousness. And people often ask me, and I address this in the book, what created consciousness? The notion of creation implies that time is linear in the first place, that there was a time before consciousness and we went from past to present to future. I think linear time is just a way we perceive the world. I think consciousness just is beyond all space and time. And a property of consciousness, and I can't really explain why, seems to be that it seeks to evolve. And this physical universe is a means of evolution of consciousness where the best way that I can even think about this is to think about our memory, because it really gets back to memory and amnesia. If this is true, what you and I are talking about, it implies that at our level of consciousness, because that's what we already know these things, and yet we don't. We've somehow forgotten. So what is the role of memory? And then you start thinking about, wait a second, can I really trust my memory? I don't remember what happened to me when I was an infant. I mean, if you asked me what happened on this exact day 3 years ago, I couldn't tell you exactly what I was doing. I can't tell you what happened in every one of my dreams. And yet during all of these periods, I was alive. There was an awareness that was there, and yet I can't recall it. So you start to have to ask questions of, is there some inherent amnesia that's included in the body that does not allow us to remember certain things unless you're in altered states? So maybe there is something to this idea that consciousness is simply evolving itself. And through these physical experiences, we're having a learning, and we're learning because we can't necessarily remember all of these things.
I love it. That's it's right up my alley. I mean, it's, have you ever read the book, Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh?
I'm familiar with his work, and my agent represents him as well. So I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah, that is a book that I spent about 5 years of researching all this different stuff. And then when I kept being told, read his book, finally said, I'm going to read Conversations with God. And it summed up everything. It just put it all together. And one of the things you're talking about is like, well, how were we created? And I love how you said, well, if we were created, that's linear, which I love that. The only notion I ever learned was that made sense to me. It was just instantaneous because there's no time.
Yes. So I love this, because if we start talking about the notion that consciousness creates matter, which is sometimes how people interpret what I'm talking about, and I sometimes use that because it's easier for people to understand. But to say that consciousness creates matter is implying linear time also.
Yep.
And I think what you say, it's almost an instantaneous, simultaneous thing that we can't grasp with our mind.
There's a great blog out that I started following years ago. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, called ericchanneling.com.
I'm not familiar with that one, but I'm familiar with a lot of channels, and I've read channeled texts.
Yeah, this blog is mind-blowing, because the original intent of it was, and I'll be short with this, mother who comes from an atheist family, and she's atheist, and so is her husband. The son ended up committing suicide, and his name was Eric. And so long story short, she's like, there's no way there's an end to my son's life. There's no way he's gone forever. I just can't believe it. And so long story short, she researched mediums until all of a sudden she found the good one. And getting information that no one would ever know. I mean, conversations that were like private that no one would ever know. And that's kind of where it evolved from. But now it gets into a lot of the everything of universal universe, God, past people's lives. They do a lot of interviews with people who have passed on and hearing what their purpose was and why they came here and what they came to learn. Because, in my spiritual training, it's all about Earth is just one big university. It's a massive conscious university, which helps accelerate us in the learning process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But one of the things he talks about, and he said this so many times, is that everything's instantaneous. He goes, humans can't comprehend that, because he goes, everything's happening at once. He goes, when you cross over the veil and you come back home, he's like, well, you're not really going anywhere. It's a state of being. But he's like, one of the things is you get overwhelmed by all the lives you're living all at the same time, interconnectedly. Mm-hmm. Which I've tried to figure that out, and I still can't.
Right. And maybe, look, if we did remember all that, or if we did have that experience, maybe it would be too overwhelming, and we wouldn't be able to have this kind of the seeming linear experience.
Totally. Have you ever played like RPG games?
A long time ago. Long time ago.
Back in the day, right? And so you get to create this player and all that good stuff. And he goes, that was my understanding. I was in a meditation one time, and it just came through to me like, this is how our lives are. You chose this character in this life at this time, at this place. Here's the lessons you want to learn. and that's it. You're going to forget everything of who you are so that you can really embrace this experience. And you get to keep some consciousness. Like they say, you can't put 100% of your spirit or soul into a life because, well, obviously our body's nervous system can't handle that much vibration frequency. But he would be like, you take some of it with you so that it helps in the experience, but you'll never have 100% of it so that you can gain and grow as much as possible.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's consistent with what I've seen in a lot of different writings. And it's the reason I decided to write the book about the brain and consciousness is that these ideas that you and I are talking about, I think are really important. But if you think that the brain produces consciousness, they are totally impossible. They're not even worth talking about. They're so outlandish. But the minute we think of consciousness as being not tied to the body, then all of these things are not only possible, but they're very reasonable.
Yeah. It just changes everything. It changes the whole ballgame.
Yeah.
Basically. Yep. And I love it. This is awesome stuff. I do want to just shift gears a little here and tie into a couple other things before we wrap this all up and all this good stuff. But, you talked about a lot of in your stuff about like artificial intelligence and science, and we got a little bit into the medicine and stuff. And what's the implications for the science, the medicine, AI, and, things on what Elon Musk is up to with Neuralink and all that?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with science in general. And like our equations in science right now are not considering consciousness for the most part. Consciousness equals zero. C equals zero in all of our equations. We don't think that our consciousness is having any effect on the physical world by conventional means. And here you and I are talking about the notion that not only is consciousness important, but it's the basis of all physical reality. So I think it just is going to revolutionize our science, and that will ripple into technology and medicine. But getting into those specific areas, let's start with artificial intelligence. This is a very hot topic, and people like Elon Musk they're talking about how AI could take over the world. And there's a show called Westworld that's very popular, which has artificial intelligence machines that all of a sudden just become conscious one day. They reach a level of complexity where they develop memories and then they have feelings and decide they kind of want to take over. I actually recently wrote an article on Thrive Global, which is Arianna Huffington's new media platform, on this topic of Westworld and how Westworld kind of misses it on consciousness. What is implied by many of the things that people talk about in the realm of AI is, well, since the brain's just a computer that produces our consciousness, once we can replicate that complex brain in another machine, it will become conscious. Consciousness will be spawned out of that machine. We just need to figure out how it can become complex enough. And that's what's implied by Westworld, is that these are machines that become complex enough to the point where they develop a memory and feelings, and then they become super dangerous. So what I would question is that a real thing? Can we create consciousness from artificial intelligence? Can we create consciousness from matter? And this is what we've talked about, is I would argue, no, we're not going to create new consciousness from it. We could make a machine that is programmed algorithmically to do things that we don't like, that could harm people. But is that machine on its own going to have a sentience? Will it have the awareness that you and I both have? I would argue that it will not be created from new physical matter. And there are some very credible people, like the inventor of the microprocessor, Federico Faggin. This is a super credible guy in the area of machine learning. And he's saying the same thing, which is that consciousness is primary. And look, if we're worried about AI, let's worry about the programmers of AI, not the machines themselves.
I love that. Yeah. And it's like, because there's, as you already know, there's, DNA programming. Could we create, instead of consciousness or soul taking over that, which I totally agree with you. I don't think that'll ever happen. I have programmers, friends, patients who are programmers, and they're like, it just takes a little bit until they become aware. Then all of a sudden they'll take over everything. And I'm just like, I'm more worried about who's writing the programs and the code and all that stuff than anything else. But can it be artificial consciousness where they, with the DNA programming and they're learning on their own and all that stuff, could that possibly shift that way, or no, completely not at all?
Well, this gets to your earlier question of, well, what's the interaction point between consciousness and our body? And our body, we are conscious beings. At least I can prove that I'm conscious, and that's, I guess, the only thing I can technically prove. And I have a physical body that I experience. So how is it that this body is interacting with the consciousness that I have? Is it possible to create some form of biology that can also do that can also pick up consciousness? Maybe. I don't know. Can we artificially create that? I think until we understand how the brain is related to our consciousness, how it's receiving it, so to speak, or what the actual touch point is, I don't think we can answer that.
Gotcha. I agree. It's just one of those things that come to my mind at times. I'm always like, I wonder. And then what's up with Elon Musk's Neuralink startup? What's all that about? I didn't even know about this.
He's kind of been quiet about it, and that's probably why you haven't heard about it. And a lot of people I talked to, there was an article on Tim Urban's blog, Wait But Why, I think is what it's called, where he talked about Elon Musk's startup, and it's called a wizard hat for the brain, where basically he's trying to optimize brain functioning using some kind of machinery. And what I gathered from the bits and pieces that are out there is that Elon Musk is taking a very conventional view of the brain, or maybe just as scientists are, which is to say, how do we optimize our own consciousness, but through the materialist lens, viewing the brain as the producer of our consciousness. And the way I look at it is, well, yeah, maybe there are tons of ways we can optimize our performance, but maybe we can optimize our psychic performance if we view the brain as being this antenna or filter of consciousness. So I think that startups like Neuralink and others that people are working on, if they recontextualize the role of the brain, then maybe we can do a whole host of other things that people aren't even looking at.
That sounds pretty cool. I think that might be interesting in many ways.
Yeah.
We'll see how that goes. Elon Musk is an interesting dude. I'm a big fan of him. Just because, a lot of people like to bash him, especially where he is right now. And he's just like, I don't care. I got a long-term vision. I'm doing what I want to do. Total
visionary. Yeah. And that's why I mentioned his startup in the book, is that he's such a smart guy that if I don't know how he's viewing the brain, but I'm glimpsing that it's probably from the conventional view that the brain's the producer of consciousness. If he shifted that perspective with his brilliant mind, what else could he help us produce?
So true. Yeah. And it's kind of cool. I think we're in a very cool era of time where, they said, it's been told the technology has sped things up. And once we understand consciousness to a whole degree, we'll be growing and expanding so fast. It's going to be unbelievable.
I agree. I think this is the next critical scientific human revolution. I mean, the last one that we saw on this scale, which I don't even think is as big, is the Copernican revolution, where we realized that the Earth was not at the center of the solar system. And Galileo was convicted of heresy for this, and he had his evidence in his telescope. And yet the clergymen didn't want to look in the telescope to see the evidence, to change their worldview. And I think we have a similar situation right now. There's tons of evidence that I chronicle in my book, and there's lots of other stuff out there, which is suggesting we have to look at life in a new way. And until our mainstream community looks in the telescope, so to speak, I think it's going to be difficult to get there.
Totally agree with you on that. Couple more questions I got. One of the things you mentioned here, talking about looking at, I kind of mentioned this a little bit with the water experiment, but what's the implications? Things like love, beauty, happiness, world peace. Just to dive in a few of those.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with love and beauty, because those are issues that I remember back when I studied psychology in college. That was technically my major, even though I kind of combined it with economics. And looking at behavioral economics is what's the evolutionary explanation for love psychologically? Lust makes a lot of sense because that enables people to reproduce, but why is love necessary? And I always remember that there were theories that if you love each other, then you treat each other better, and it gives the gene pool a better chance of survival. And there were lots of theories about it, but it was always unclear as to whether it was an exact relationship, if it was just purely based on genetic evolution. What this theory of consciousness is suggesting is that maybe there's another view on love, which is that love is a property of the underlying consciousness that we all are. And that's why people, when they get out of their brain state, when they're in a near-death experience or on the psychedelic, when they unlock the filter, they experience that which is already there and is just typically filtered out. So maybe love is part of that property of consciousness, part of the property of our identity. So when we think about the love between two people, maybe that is the recognition of our shared being as the same consciousness, but in another person.
It's pretty cool. Where we were created from love, as some people say.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's an idea that I would have rolled my eyes at a few years ago, but I completely agree with you now. I think that's exactly right from this other lens.
Yeah. And when you look at it from that perspective, because, it's been told many times, God is love and love is God. And all the biblical texts that talk about, we're the made like image of God. So then I'm like, well, we're made out of love, and we're love itself, and love is our natural form. And so I love the way you put it that way, in that perspective.
Yep. And that leads to beauty, which I think is an even more difficult one for for traditional evolutionary explanations. Why is it beautiful to see a sunset? Like, why do we care so much? Why is a painting beautiful? If you look at consciousness from the lens that we're talking about, maybe whereas love is the recognition of our shared being in another person, beauty is the recognition of consciousness, our shared being with anything physical, but in a non-sentient thing. And we call that beauty.
Cool way of looking at it. I like that. Mm-hmm. Happiness, is that, again, what's your implications on that? Like, because we're in a very depressed society right now.
Yeah, I'm sure you see it all the time in your practice that, I think there's a lot of mental illness, and it usually comes down to happiness, is that people are seeking happiness where the converse is that they are trying to reduce suffering. I think they're very much the same thing.
Couldn't agree with you more. That's kind of the way I look at it too. And also I always tell people happiness is just at a viewpoint of external events. It's not something from internal. Like, wow, I had money that came in that I didn't expect to happen. Ooh, I'm feeling good today. Or I know there's going to be a lot of people here in Chicago complaining because today is the first day of snowfall. So there's going to be a lot of complaints going on. It's a horrible day because of that. And that's really, but I like how you said suffering, reducing suffering.
Right.
And I think that is a huge, huge component of people looking at it from that perspective.
Yeah. And it gets to the question of, how do we achieve happiness then? And I kind of end up in a position that I think you were just pointing towards, which is that we tend in our society to look externally for things to find happiness, of the next job, the next relationship, the next house or car or something material. But that is always an externalization of things. And yet what you and I are describing is the notion that everything is just one consciousness and there's nothing outside of that consciousness. So to seek happiness outside of the self is almost trying to seek happiness in an illusion. And I think that's why in psychology, it's called the hedonic treadmill, where you get something and you're happy for a split second, but then you're back on the treadmill and you're kind of back to neutral. Like those external things don't get you to the happy place, because happiness, I would argue, is something that comes fully internally.
I love that. And you're making up some great points where it's kind of the thing, like we've been indoctrinated to let our external world dictate our internal, and it starts as when we're children. Were you a good boy or are we a bad boy? When we go to school, the whole school system is based on that. How good am I? Well, I'm only good based if I got A's in class. If I don't get A's, I'm not that good. And it's that whole indoctrinating of doing that and conditioning all along the way. So by the time, 7 years old is when the mind starts to shift gears and start going more logical. The blood-brain barrier thickens up. So basically we're all who we are. Well, we can change this though, but who we are, our mind processes and how the brain sees the world is 7 years old, up to there. And it's one of those things where I think where we're shifting towards, or where you and I have been talking about, is the shift is now going to start looking at, okay, let's look internal. And what do we have to do there? And it just leads to everything we're talking about, consciousness in general. Change your consciousness, and all of a sudden it shifts your entire world in a whole different realm.
It completely does. It completely does. So it might be that this underlying cause of a lot of the angst that we see in the world today, whether it manifests as anxiety or depression or other things, comes from this inability to find happiness in the external world. And people just don't know what to do, because there's an underlying belief that the material world, there's something outside of us, and it's not satisfying people.
No. And just think about it this way too. Our attention span is down to, I think, 8 seconds. Last time I heard, which is crazy. Think about that for a second. And you were just talking about what is the hedonic treadmill? I'm going to definitely, yes. I love that. Just think about it. You're happy for 8 seconds, and then all of a sudden you go back and you're right. It's just this thing where we're not holding on grasp of things, in my opinion.
Yes. You're bringing me to an analogy that I really like when thinking about this, is like sometimes when you, I'm thinking about, I was a college athlete. If you win a tennis match, you're really happy about it for a few minutes, and then you worry about the next match. But there is that period of time when you get the thing that you want and you're happy. It does happen, but you end up still on the treadmill. So if you think about happiness as being our actual state of being as consciousness that is just clouded out, it's sort of like our happiness is the sun that's always there. And we have these clouds that are our thoughts or our perceptions and our expectations. And when we achieve the thing we want, maybe it's a temporary removal of some of the clouds. So we experience the happiness or the sun that was always there the whole time. And we falsely attribute the event as the thing that caused the happiness, when all the event did was actually just temporarily remove the block to happiness.
So true. I love it, man. Really, really good stuff here. Before we wrap up here, you just launched a podcast. What's it all about?
I have not launched it yet, but
you're about to launch a podcast then.
I will be. Yeah, I don't have the exact date yet, but my website, which is just my name, Mark Gober, MarkGober.com, will be announcing that when it comes out in the next few months in social media. But the general gist of the podcast is that I interview many of the scientists that I talk about in my book and people who've had near-death experiences. So it's, if my book is just the quotations of these people, the podcast is hearing firsthand how these people have had experiences and how they've run studies and what they've gone through. I
can't wait to listen to it, man. It's going to be, that's right up my alley. I'm all about that. So how do, awesome stuff here. And how can people connect? What's the book? Where can they get the book?
The book is available on my website, but also Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many bookstores. So just typical places you should be able to find it. It's called An End to Upside Down Thinking, and the subtitle is Dispelling the Myth That the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. Love it. I'm definitely going to pick up a copy and read that. You're speaking my language. I don't want to say love language. That's something totally different, but I'll just say conscious language for that matter. How can people connect with you besides website, social media links, anything like that? I would say social media is a good way, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, but also my website has a contact page. And if people want to send personal messages, I will personally respond to them. So you can leave a note there. Awesome. Well, Mark, I appreciate having you on. This was, I know it's going to be very rewarding for my listeners, but it was very rewarding for myself, a fresh breath air here, just to chat some of the science behind all this and get diving in deep. So I'll definitely have you on again in the near future to dive in deeper with some things here, but I appreciate you, brother. Yeah, no, that was fun. And thank you. And thanks for all that you're doing. It's wonderful for me to talk to somebody who's so into this realm and practicing it on a day-to-day basis. No, it's my pleasure. So until next time, man, just keep rocking and rolling. Okay. You too. Thank you for listening to the podcast. For past shows, please visit www.empoweryourreality.com. I hope this show inspired you and added to your life to help you on the journey to rediscover who you really are. To connect with us on Facebook, please visit www.facebook.com/Dr. Vic Manzo. Check us out on Twitter. The handle is Dr. Vic21. Follow us on Instagram, www.instagram.com/Dr. Vic Manzo. If you were inspired by the podcast, pay it forward by sharing it with someone who you know can benefit from it. Thank you again for listening to the Mindful Experiment podcast, sharing paths to help you rediscover your infinite potential.